Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Mark Lewis. I'm the literary branch chair here, and we're glad to see such a full house. I had to bring out extra chairs. That never happened. Is this still projecting? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, for those of you who may not have been to the Art Center very much, the men's room is out in the patio. You go through it. There's a door you'll figure out. Women's room is to your left down the hall the way you came in. And without further ado, let's do this. My panel. How many people don't know Kathy Broesamle? What the heck? So Kathy and John met when they were both doing summer jobs in Yosemite, which is we'll go. And they were, of course, married 60 years, and Kathy was John's partner in many ways, including in environmental activism, of course, here in Ojai, and a retired OUSD speech therapy. There we go. Okay. To her left, Nana Monteverde Rafferty, our special guest. She came all the way. Oh, there we go. All the way from Los Alamitos in Orange County. She's originally from L.A., and she is the daughter of Al Monteverde, who's the guy in the middle, right? Who John writes about. And again, it's all Yosemite related, as you will soon hear. And thank you for coming all this way, Nana. We appreciate it. And someone else you don't know, which of course is Carolyn Von Driska, Kathy and John's daughter. That's a joke. Of course you know Carolyn, who is, among other things, on the board of the Defense Fund, which her father was the founding president of, and was heavily involved in the making of this book, as was Kathy, as was Nana. So, thank you all for being here, and we will get underway. Oh, let me sit.
I would like to do a real thank you for a lot of my friends who brought cookies today. Barbara Washburn, Laura Denny, Karen Corrigan, and
We're a little bit actually planning. Thanks to your generous contributions to our 85th anniversary capital fund, we will soon have a much better sound system. But for today, we have to pass the mic. So bear with us. Anyway, we're going to start. We're going to go back and forth here. Oh, I should thank Perry. Where's Perry Van Houten? He's over there. For the wonderful article he did yesterday. So anyway, let's start with you, Kathy. How is it, because part of the theme here, we are being that we're the literary branch and so forth. Everyone talks about John, and rightfully so, as the great hero of, or certainly one of them, of saving Ojai from rapaciousness, put it that way. But, he was a professional historian, academic historian. Got a PhD from Columbia, wasn't it? And taught at CSUN. He actually wrote 10 books, I think. It was the last one, of course, published posthumously. One of his books was actually the history of CSUN. I didn't realize that. So, and by the way, we will have copies available after, if you want to buy John's book, $20 per his newest book, I mean. And you can also get them at Circana. Is Misty Jerry here?
No.
But, oh, well, anyway, she is co-owner of Circana in the arcade, and she also will sell, has good a stock, or is stocking, copies of Transforming Paradise and also the Defense Fund book, which was ROI. So thank you, Misty. And anyway, back to the subject at hand. Kathy, we're going to go back and forth a little because what the heck, just to confuse you. But we'll start by wondering, how is it that John became such a prolific author? In other words, was it follow from being an academic historian, or was he always intrigued by making words sing?
John had no idea he was going to be a prolific author when I first met him. He was going to be a junior high social studies teacher. And he came from parents who were who were teachers. He came from his father was a high school civics teacher, and his mother was a preschool teacher with adult education down in Long Beach. And he was an only child, and they didn't have academic aspirations for him particularly at all, but they did instill a lot of respect for learning and education in him as he was growing up. And he started off in junior college, and there was a history professor at Long Beach City College that inspired him, and he ended up, after a year of being there, going to UC Berkeley, and he was going to be a history major, but, he was kind of a lost soul in Berkeley. He was just one of a million students. And so John and I met and became engaged, and so he decided to go to my college, which was the University of the Pacific, where he became a big fish in a small pond. And the history professors there really liked John. He was their star student, and it really gave him a big boost, and he got a lot of help from them that propelled him on to go to Columbia University for his graduate work. And then I think in Columbia, he began to discover that he loved writing, and he wrote his thesis, which became his first book, on William Gibbs McAdoo, who was the Secretary of the Treasury under Woodrow Wilson. And then, of course, he became a professor at Cal State Northridge, and they expected publication along with a high teaching load, and so he always prioritized, well, both of those things, really. He was a much beloved teacher, and he was very, very committed to his writing. And he had a lot of willpower when it came to just sticking to his project and getting it done. And so from one book to the next, gradually he became a person who loved writing. And this last book was the one that really kept him going until he just couldn't do it anymore. But he just loved doing that project, and I loved doing it with him because we got to go look at all these CCC sites in Yosemite together when he was feeling well, and it was so much fun. And I was honored to be able to do that with him.
Thank you. Let me read something from Forward, which was written by Mark Frost, who is traveling, I believe, unable to be here today. But he, after he moved to Ohio, became great friends with John. I think he joined the Defense Fund, and that's how they would have met. Yeah. Anyway, Mark, if you don't know, was the co-creator of Twin Peaks, film director, writer, author himself. So he wrote the foreword, and in part it talks about the book is about basically, and I begin to quote here, Yosemite's transformation in the 1920s and 30s from an untamed wilderness embodying the lofty conservationist ideals of John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt, John writes, into the modern, preserved, and accessible wonder of the world it is today, is the key piece of the narrative that had been missing before John decided to tackle it. And Mark concludes a little later, because John had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 5 years ago, roughly, which of course is not a good thing to hear at all. But he made this his final project, and Mark writes, with characteristic stoic resolve and extraordinary medical care, he beat the odds, surviving to live another 5 years that he later called the most important and satisfying of his life. In the presence of mortality, he said, the presence, I should say, of mortality, he said, has a marvelous way of focusing one's heart and mind. Dedicating these precious weeks and months to his family and friends, he decided to capstone his life's work with this saga of Yosemite's forgotten decades. As a living link to that period, he brought together his personal and professional passion in this elegiac tale of a vanishing era that would have, without him, passed into time's shadow. So this is, as he said, the capstone of John's, certainly that's how John saw it. Now let me pass it over to Nona to tell us about what he was writing about, the CCC and so forth.
Thank you all for being here. It's so special. My dad's part. In 1987, my dad, at 72, hand wrote his story of being one of the boys, and I put it in quotes because it was a positive expression and connotation in those days, one of the boys of the CCC. His story has become our family story. And he wrote it by hand on yellow lined pad of paper. And during COVID, Gary, my husband, and I took it on as a project and turned it into a Shutterfly book with all of his photographs. And that book is in the back if anybody would like to look at it. It is word for word his story as one of the boys in the CCC. Well, fast forward a couple of months, and on a Facebook site that is a group site for Yosemite history, I read about, anybody have any stories about the boys in the CCC? And that was Carolyn's post. Well, I very innocently said, yeah, I have a story, and I have a ton of photographs. Well, boom. That put us together in a relationship, a lot of emails between John and me, sharing my dad's story and his photographs. Late in COVID, we finally got to meet, and we felt like friends already. And over the years since, we have become friends. And it is such a wonderful part of my life to be now connected with all of you. A little bit of the background of where this all came about. Where did the CCCs, why did it happen? Well, it was because of the Great Depression, a severe, prolonged economic catastrophe, widespread unemployment, poverty, desperate situations, nearly 250,000 men out of work. FDR started it within 3 months of becoming president. He started the New Deal program, and the CCC program was the capstone of that. 3 million men became employed in the CCC. 3 million. It had a 9-year run, 1933 to 42, with a substantial impact. The profile was a young man needed to be between 18 and 25 years of age and from a needy family. They earned $30 a month, 25 of which was sent directly home. That boy never saw it. He got $5 to live off of during that month as his stipend. My dad fit that profile. His family was desperate. They were crushed by the Depression. He was 1 year old when his family came from Mexico to the United States. His father was killed in a car accident when he was 7, and his mother never went to work and never spoke English. They were living in Los Angeles at the time, and my dad chose what we would today call a magnet school. He chose to go to a high school, Fremont High School, whose emphasis was photography. His brother and sister went to other high schools, but he was interested in photography at a very young age. He left high school 2 months before graduation, fibbing about his age because he was not 18, he was 17, but nobody asked. And as John said in his book, nobody really cared. He fit the bill, and his family was desperate. So in April of 1933, 3 months after FDR started the CCC, my dad was on a bus in downtown LA, and he was on his way to Fort MacArthur in San Pedro. All the boys had medical exams and were issued World War II uniforms. World War I uniforms, thank you.
This is Gary.
He's my other half. He knows the story. The boys were assigned to different camps. They had no idea where they were going. My dad said that a couple of his friends were with him, and they immediately got separated, and he never saw them again. He was put on a train to Fresno and told that he was going to Yosemite. He could only imagine. From Fresno, they were put on trucks, and they were trucked right outside of Yosemite to Buck Meadows. What was the CCC in Yosemite? Ended up having 8,000 young men serve in the CCC in Yosemite. There were 10 permanent camps and a lot of seasonal camps. My dad was in 2 of the permanent camps in the 20 months that he was in the CCC, and a number of what they called stub camps. Buck Meadows, as my dad arrived and he tells his story, had long barracks and double bunks. They were each handed a canvas bag when they got off those trucks and told to go outside and fill them with straw. And those became their beds. And here's my dad on his bed.
Note how skinny he is.
We'll pass this around.
He was hungry, pre-depressed. Yeah. The Army housed and closed them. The Army housed them, the federal government closed them, and the Forest Service was in charge of the work program. The jobs differed on their assignments. There was fire trail maintenance, clearing the undergrowth for fire breaks. They were given brown bag lunches whenever they were leaving the camp, and those were always a bologna sandwich, peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and an apple or an orange. They sawed logs, they split firewood, and on the weekends, they had a little bit of fun also. They went to the Cliff House, which has since burned down. They went to Bowers Cave, which is a cavern that's now not widely accessible. They did gold panning, but my dad swore that the 49ers got it all. Then he was moved to Camp 5, which is Merced Grove, in late May, at the high country, 6,000-foot elevation. He was now inside Yosemite National Park. The site was Crane Flats. The ride up, he quoted in his story, was one revelation after the other. This is a kid from LA who had never seen the pines and the beautiful lush foliage that he was exposed to. At this camp, the tents were wood floors and frames, and they hadn't finished being erected. So the boys completed putting up their own living structures, which had tent sites, which makes me think they're very much like the Camp Curry sites, that with the tent cabins in Camp Curry. He said it took 2 or 3 days to dig wells so that they could have water, fresh water. The jobs there consisted of felling trees. Now imagine that no chainsaws existed yet. Their saws were 8 foot in length, and 2 men on their knees dragged that saw, cutting a giant 6-foot tree diameter. They were to leave no sign of the tree and cut it to the ground. And he said it was not easy work. They also did the bug crew. The bug crew is today what we would call the bark beetle, in cutting them, debarking them, and burning the bark. And a gooseberry crew. Gooseberry bushes play a big part in fungal disease for the sugar pines, and they would burn them. My dad learned to operate a bulldozer and to use dynamite to get rid of the stubs of the trees. But it was early in that Camp 5 that my dad became the official photographer. He was supplied a Kodak camera by one of the rangers for film and the use of the darkroom in the park headquarters. He photographed Camp 5, nearby camps. He provided photos for the Forestry Monthly reports. He traveled to fish hatcheries and road building and fire trail maintenance. His book, if anyone wants to thumb through it, has just historic photographs of all of these sites. To develop the photos, he would have to hitch a ride from where his camp was down the mountain. And there was only one dark room in the valley, and he shared it with Ansel Adams. His first trip to the valley floor just brings to life what it must have been like for a 17-year-old kid from LA to experience Yosemite. He said, heretofore, I'd never seen Yosemite Valley. He took the big oak flat road with the group, and halfway down, he said, I saw my first glimpse, quote, the most beautiful view I had ever seen. And then he went on, and he wrote this, in his 80s, and he said, quote, I see it in my mind to this day when I close my eyes, when I want a moment of peace. For recreation, these boys did what they could to find some fun. They saw the movies in the valley. They had snow play where they would slide down, putting anything underneath them that they could get their hands on to slide down a hill. This is a kid who'd never seen snow. They watched the ice skaters. They couldn't afford to ice skate, but they watched them from the watered parking lot, layer after layer of ice. And they went swimming in a hole called Steamboat Bay that I learned later was filled in, no longer this endless pit of water that they dove into. A rock slide took it out. There were stub camps that my dad was part of. There was bridge work over Floresta Creek, but the most enjoyable one that he ever talked about was building a fire lookout at Trumbull Peak. It was 5 miles west of the park boundary, where the Yosemite Lumber Company #1 was located. He said they never got a day off. It was 7 days a week. It was building a 65-foot-high lookout to complement the pilot peak lookout that already existed. They cleared the roadside. They drilled by hand into the rock. They bulldozed to level it. They dynamited. And then finally, when the steel and lumber arrived, they built the tower, he said, like an erector set. There's photos of it in the book back there that my dad has. Recreation, my dad told some stories that make me giggle. He said some of the guys collected money and went down 9,000 feet to Indian Flat on a steep railroad incline for a gallon of wine. He said at nightfall, they knew that there was no way they were going to see them. But there they appeared with that gallon of wine, and they all cheered. Can you imagine? They also went to Merced, which was 60 miles away. He said they would rent a truck, and the boys went to town. And some of his stories, I won't repeat here, about crossing the railroad tracks into the other side of town. Winter came, and they went down to the 3,000-foot level, to a different stub camp. It was an abandoned Forest Service fire crew area. They had to finish building their own tents. He said it took them days, and one day he woke up with frost on the outside of his blankets. But once it was complete, he said, with wearing 3 pair of long johns and with the potbelly stove in their cabin, he was okay. What did they do there? Road repair, grading, building drainage channels. And Carolyn has a picture of some of those drainage channels. Rebuilding rock retaining walls along the Bryceburg grade. And learning new jobs, like driving a Caterpillar and learning how to drive a grader. They also did firefighting, both prevention and actual firefighting. Prevention in the El Portal area, along a 6 to 7 mile along area of the river, they took out all the dry grass because the steam engines would catch the brush on fire along that path. They actually did firefighting as well. The CCC joined local men and the Forest Service crews. Dad got his Forest Service driver's license and became a fire truck driver. Imagine all the skills these young men who've been out of work, all the skills that they were taught, that did them well through life, gave them those skills to have a job when those jobs were available. 20 months later, my dad was home. He headed back to LA with the promise of work. He soon got a job in his chosen work, which is news photography. He became a career newspaper photographer covering many major news and sports stories. The CCC, building upon his high school experience, gave him the opportunity to hone those skills and to hone his passion for photography. Notable photographers whose photos earned him national recognition, including a Pulitzer Prize nomination. Wow. My dad was a decorated World War II combat photographer in the South Pacific, and there's a book in the back, the history of the Marine Corps, and there's a photograph of my dad in it. He was part of what's called the Demons, and it was a group of photographers that risked their life. Like my uncle used to say, your dad went into combat with a camera. He said the secondary thing was his rifle. My dad's story became our family story. He introduced Yosemite to his wife, my mom, to his sister, to his mom, to his mother-in-law in the 30s and 40s, and then come 50s and 60s, he introduced it to me and to my brother. And he would always pull over when we were entering on State Highway 41, just at the right point where he would pull over, get out with his binoculars, and look for that tower, look for the fire lookout that he could see across the valley. It was so important to him that we had a picture of it hanging in our house my whole life. And we'd all get out of the station wagon and see through Dad's binoculars that tower. He was so proud of it. In the 70s, I took my husband Gary and introduced him to Yosemite. First time he'd ever seen it. We honeymooned in a 2-man tent camping in early April. My parents had taught me how to do that. In the mid-'80s, we took our sons for the first time, and every single Easter, we took them to Yosemite. Fast forward, now we take our grandchildren and extended family, and every Easter, we can be found in Yosemite, maybe as many as 20 of us. My dad's book ends with the conclusion, and I quote, I believe that in those days of deep depression, the CCC was a lifesaver for thousands of young men that had nowhere to turn. It made men of boys and taught us to get along away from home and taught us many skills. Many of those young boys followed the skills into later life. And he goes on to say, quote, despite the bad times, the experience was one of maturing, learning, and happiness, a time when our country was finding itself, as was I. That's my dad's story.
Thank you, Nona. That was great. Now, if I have my count correct, between your dad and your grandchildren, that's 5 generations.
Yes, it is.
And if I have my count correct, between John and either his parents or his in-laws? His grandparents. Anyway, and to Carolyn's kids, another 5 generations. So let's turn to Kathy to talk about why or how your family became total Yosemite heads. And then we'll turn to Carolyn to talk about how this book came to be.
Like my parents?
Yeah, well, the whole family.
Okay, well, let me start with, I was a preacher's kid, and we got a month off every year, and so my parents took us to Yosemite Valley one summer and discovered it was too crowded down there, so we packed up and went up to Tuolumne Meadows. And it was so cold up there at nighttime, much colder than it is today, unfortunately. But it was so wonderful up there. There were rangers who really knew what they were talking about, and they became the people who educated me and gave me my entire philosophy about being outdoors. The first summer that we went there, we had this great big box trailer, it was this gigantic thing, and my dad drove it over Tioga Pass, and somehow we got to the campground, and no sooner did we get settled than I came down with the mumps. And then my brother came down with the mumps. And then my dad came down with the mumps. My mother was the only one that didn't come down with the mumps. So there was some discussion about her driving that big box trailer and all of us back home so we could recover at home. And it was decided that that was more than she could handle. So we just stayed there with the mumps for a couple of weeks that summer. And there was this great ranger whose name was Carl Sharsmith up there, renowned. Many books have been written about him.
A lot about him in the book.
Yeah. And he would lead hikes, of course. And so after we had recovered from our mumps, at least we thought we had, we went to meet Carl Sharsmith to take a hike with him. He took one look at us and he took off, and we never saw him again that whole day. He did not want to catch the mumps. So anyway, that was my memory. And so we would go back every summer for about a month. And my older brother, 3 years older than I was, got a job at the gas station up there. And then when I was old enough, I got a job. I didn't get Tuolumne Meadows. I ended up at the Glacier Point Hotel, which no longer exists. But that was one of the best summers of my life, seeing that part of the park and being part of that area and taking hikes from there and hiking from Glacier Point to Tuolumne and climbing Half Dome and all those things that I did now that are kind of hard to do now because there are so many people and you have to sign up and do lotteries and all that kind of stuff. We just went out and did it. But I really am so grateful to my parents for giving me the Yosemite wilderness. We took pack trips and just did all the things. John's parents were more into fishing, and my dad once caught a limit, and he was so proud, but that was about it. But they went up there every summer, and eventually my dad's work changed to the point where he could build a cabin up there in Wawona, and so that was in 1960, and 63, I think it was. John and I were married that year. And so from then on, that cabin has stayed in the family. It burned down one time and then got rebuilt. And it's been my place to escape to for many years. I was just there last week when my house was tented for termites. I had to get out of there. So thank goodness for that home and for all the memories. And I'm just so lucky to have that in my background. And I think Carolyn will tell more about the other side.
Well, tell about how you ended up.
Yeah, the 28-mile drive,
It was longer than that.
Well, 60 years also.
Yeah, that was my first. I was like the summer I turned 18. I got a job up there at 17 too. You were supposed to be 18, but I told him I was 17, so no big deal. So I was 17 years old working at the Glacier Point Hotel. But I really wanted to be in Tuolumne Meadows. That was my heartthrob spot, and my brother worked there. And so I somehow hitchhiked over there one morning and spent my day off in Yosemite. But, I was only 17. I had no way to get back to Glacier Point. It was like a 3-hour drive with the way the roads were in those days back in 1960. So my brother, bless his heart, he and my husband, John, had a little tiff over a chess game, which I'll spare you the details of that. But anyway, he convinced John to give me a ride back home because John had a brand new car. And so, I met John for the first time. I got in his car, we started driving, and there was a full moon, and we drove across the valley, and it was just so beautiful, and John was just the most amazing person. He asked me what I thought about things on that drive. And mostly in those days, it was like, well, this is what I think. Nobody asked me what I thought about anything. It was all, you say that, so I guess it must be right. But no, he was that way his whole life from the first day I met him. Got back to Glacier Point Hotel, and he dropped me off. It was about 3:00 in the morning, and I got him an ice cream bar and told him goodbye, and he went back home and got back in time for work the next day. I don't know how he managed to work the next day. I had no sleep at night. But anyway, that was our first meeting. And then the next year, I managed to get over and have a job actually in Tuolumne Meadows. And I was driving this really rickety old camper with my mother in it down to the valley, and it went off the road, and the ambulances came and hauled her down to the hospital in Yosemite Valley, and she had broken her pelvis thanks to my inept driving, because I was still an inexperienced driver. And what do you know, John came in one day to the little side hall where I was the waitress, and he said, "You want to go down to the valley and see your mom?" And so he took me down to see my mom, and, you know, he was just the most thoughtful person in the whole wide world. And so things kind of started up from there. So it wasn't about a year later we got married. We were still in college.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Kathy. So we're going to pass that over to Carolyn. As you may have one or two things you want to throw in there, including the Alex Haley story, which we skipped, but eventually get to how this book came together.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Closer. Okay. Kiss the microphone. Well, the Alex Haley story, I'll take you down a rabbit hole for a minute. My parents and I was a baby. We were living in Washington, D.C., and my dad was doing his research for his first book on William Gibbs McAdoo at the Library of Congress. And they kind of told the punchline. But that's all right. But so he was there one night on a Friday night, and this was back when the card catalogs used to be in the beautiful rotunda of the Library of Congress, and Dad was there madly researching, and so was another gentleman, and it was just the two of them, and it was late at night, and they got to talking, and they asked each other what they were working on, and it turned out it was Alex Haley. He just said to my dad, "I'm working on a book about my family," and it turned out to be him, and it's just kind of a cool story because they got to meet later when Alex came and spoke at Cal State Northridge, so they had a moment to talk about that, which was neat. And yeah, William Gibbs McAdoo, really interesting person, was a senator from California. I didn't know much about him, of course, and probably most don't, but for me, it sort of comes full circle because that was Dad's first book, and in this book, there's a yeah, FDR spent a day in Yosemite, and there's some really iconic photos of him in a convertible car, and William Gibbs McAdoo is in that car with him. So it's kind of neat that the bookend to Dad's writing career also features William Gibbs McAdoo. But in terms of the book, yeah, this was a book that faced a lot of hurdles. It's really a miracle it was ever written, and when I think back on it, I'm so glad with the way it all turned out, because had it not had the bumps in the road, we would never have met Nona, and the fact that she and actually 3 others that I met on Facebook shared their dads with my dad is what makes this book so special in many ways, including to me. So things tend to work out the way they're supposed to. But, you know, Dad was an historian by passion and by profession, and he really cared about documenting the contributions of people who came before us, and I think he really understood that you have to document the past in order to protect the future. And for as long as I can remember, it bothered him that nothing of substance had ever been written about that era in Yosemite, and the extraordinary contributions of those CCC boys. If you've been to Yosemite, you have seen CCC boy work. You may not know it, but it is everywhere, hiding in plain sight. How many of you have been to Yosemite? And have you gone through the Tioga Pass entrance? That's CCC right there. That beautiful, iconic stonework in Yosemite, that is CCC. And so the buildings, the Tuolumne Meadows Visitor Center, it is everywhere. And so there are a lot. Who's climbed Half Dome on those crazy cables? Okay, I have not, so I should not. I'm afraid of heights, so that is one hike in Yosemite I won't do. But I'll take you down a little bit of a rabbit hole because these are some of my favorites, and these are in the book. The CCC boys are who put up those cables. And this is, yeah, that'd be great. These are CCC boys. And look at what they're wearing. I mean, they're so well dressed and so ill prepared to be perched on, and you never know. Maybe one of those is Al. It's just so great to think about. But yeah, so Dad was concerned that nothing had been written because these boys would have been born in 1915 to 1920. Yeah, Nona's dad would have been 109 today. So most of those boys we had already lost, and their children were getting older. And so if somebody didn't document this, the story just wasn't ever going to get told. But, there were other things that came first. Dad was busy with the Land Conservancy, acquiring open space in the early 2000s, and that took much of his time for several years. Then he went blind, and so that kind of derailed things. And then the community asked him to create the Ojai Valley Defense Fund, which he did. He thought he was making a pretty good bet when he said, well, I tell you what, if I ever regain my vision, then I'll do it. And he never expected to regain his vision. And so when he did, he honored his commitment. And now that's a community chest of $1.4 million protecting the environmental well-being of the Ojai Valley. So, well, thanks. Yeah, Dad, if you knew Dad, you knew how humble he was. And Dad, you're not here, so I get to brag about you. Sorry. But yeah, so that took much of his time. And then at the beginning of 2018, the Defense Fund needed just $200,000 more to get us over the $1 million mark. And so they asked him to come back in and do a fundraising run, and he successfully completed that. So in the spring of 2018, he kind of had his to-do list behind him, and maybe there was time to write this book. But in May of 2018, the inoperable pancreatic cancer diagnosis came. So it really, at that point, felt like it was just never going to happen. But, he had an extraordinary oncologist, and as only happens in Ojai. If you know Alan and Janet Jacobs, then his son, Alan, their son-in-law, Josh, who's also the beloved doctor of others in this room, including me, he saved Dad's life. And he, through some really brutal chemo and radiation over the course of about a year, he kicked that cancer to the curb for Dad. And so in the fall, it was probably around the late fall of 2019, Dad said, I'm going to go for it. I think I might just live long enough to write this book. I can't believe it. And so he did, as Dad always did, and started making his list. He was going to go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. He was going to go to the Yosemite Archives, and he started pulling his plan together, and he was off to the races. And then guess what happened? COVID shut everything down. And so again, what are we going to do? How are we going to get this book written? And Dad really thought it was game over because he couldn't, all the archives, all the tools that trained historians use were shuttered. And so I had this brilliant idea of, well, why don't we see what we can find on Facebook? And if you knew Dad, you know how much he hated social media. He just thought it was terrible, a terrible waste of time. And I said, well, let me try. And sure enough, I started putting out some feelers in the Yosemite history groups and in there are various CCC groups. And Nona responded, and, that began a wonderful relationship. And Dad had more rich material than he could have ever gotten at an archive. And so did 3 other CCC sons and daughters reached out and agreed to share their father's stories with him. And all 4 of these boys, we call them boys, CCC boys, had kept rich and enduring memoirs. Al's was certainly by far the most detailed, but we have photos, and Al's photos are throughout the book. And Dad suddenly had all the content that he needed. And so while the rest of us were sheltering in place miserable, Dad was happily researching and pouring through all the many things that Nona shared with him, and he began writing the book. And he really made the most of those 5 years because he actually did 2 books during that time. He did the Our Ojai book, which is a book of photographs compiled and generously shared with us by 14 local photographers, including Steve Adams, who's here, and Harry Van Houten provided a quote for it, and probably others. Oh, and Cindy's photos, yes, of course. Cindy, you know Cindy Burton's beautiful photos are throughout the book, including my favorite turkey photo, the iconic East End turkey flock. Let's see, I'm distracting myself. So, yeah, Dad wrote and completed the book while that cancer was in remission. And then he started reaching out to publishers. And that's really tough to get a book published. But Cal State Fresno wanted to publish his book, and they extended an offer in about May of 2023. And Dad got sick a couple of weeks later, and he died in June of 2023. But we had the publishing contract, and I reached out to the publisher, and I said, you know, the book is done. Would you be willing to let me see it through? And there began a really beautiful opportunity for me to spend, I'll try to say this without crying, but Dad was home on hospice for 12 days. And, sorry, during that time, he wanted to work on his book. And so there's a map in the book that he put together 3 days into hospice. And our final conversation the night before he died, he really wanted to talk about photo captions. It was really important to him that photo captions be short, no long-winded photo captions. And so he showed me an example of what not to do. And what's funny is he had written most of the captions already, but I promise you, if you read the book, you'll notice that all of the captions are very short. And so I then, you think I could stop crying about this, but you know Dad was amazing, so it's hard to be without him. So I began this beautiful relationship with the publisher, and we've become fast friends. And I appreciate that they trusted me to put the book together. And so rather than them putting the book together, they let me do it. And so a local graphic designer who's extraordinarily talented and I were off to the races for the next year. And ironically, his partner's work is this art behind us. And so, so he designed the book. And by then, the Yosemite Archives was back open. And so I am now dear friends with the archivists there, and they helped me find a few. Let me back up. Normally, Dad was used to publishers being really cheap about how many photos you could put in a book because of the added expense. But Cal State Fresno said, go for it. Put as many as you want in. And so I was able to add a few that I know Dad would have really loved. And this is one that my friend, the archivist, found for me. And Dad never got to see this one, but it's one of my favorites. If you've been to Yosemite, you've been to Tunnel View, right? You know, that iconic view shed? Well, here's the first day the CCC boys arrived in Yosemite. You see Bridal Veil Falls, and they were looking at Yosemite just like all of us do when we visit it. And I often wonder if Al is somewhere in that in that photo. And here they are going up to a work day. You can see how they're piled up all over the trucks. And one of the reasons Dad loves that photo on the cover so much of the 3 CCC boys is because most of the photos from that era are group photos with, you know, piles of young men in them. But this one shows 3 CCC boys up close and personal, and don't they look just like our brothers, our sons? You know, they could be one of us, and they were in so many ways. And let's see, I'm probably droning on, but the CCC work is just everywhere in Yosemite. So if you go to Yosemite and you want to know where to see it, just let me know. But, you know, has anybody been to Ojai before? The CCC work is all over Ojai, too. Do you know that?
No. Where?
Well,
They created 3 bridges up Cesar Canyon.
Yep. And if you've been to Denison Park or Foster Park here, I come from educators, so I know that visual aids are important. So the beautiful stone work and picnic benches in our parks, that's all CCC. And have you ever noticed the drainage, the beautiful stone drains on Gridley and on Signal?
Yes.
Guess what? CCC. Where's Bill Norris? This is right across the street from your son's house. CCC, right there. So it's really everywhere, and it was almost 100 years ago. And those CCC boys are, they're really the gift that keeps on giving. And I'm just so grateful, and I know Dad was too. And Mom says that she thinks it was the book that kept them going, and I think I agree, that he really wanted to make sure that those boys were going to be remembered. Let's see, there was something else I was trying to remember to talk about. Oh, the award.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So I guess the last thing I'll say is, again, Dad was so humble, he would be cringing if he knew I was talking about this. But I'm really excited about this because there's a think tank called the Living New Deal, and it sits on the campus of UC Berkeley, so that's kind of serendipitous with Dad having gone there. It's a national organization that the organization and its supporters think a lot like Dad do, that the New Deal era was so pivotal to our history that it's really important that an archive be created and that all those contributions of that era be remembered. And so the publisher has nominated Dad's book for something called the Living New Deal Award. And it's a prestigious publishing award that I hope it's selected. And if it is, it'll be bestowed at the FDR Presidential Library in New York. So hopefully, stay tuned. Hopefully Perry will let you know if that works out for us. But we're just honored that there's such interest and support. Park professionals, rangers, ecologists, forestry professionals, everybody wanted this book to be written, and everybody bent over backwards to make sure that it could be. So that's how it came to be.